Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. I do have one quick favor before we get to the video that you came here for, and that is very simply this. You see that little red subscribe button below this video? Go ahead, smash that subscribe button. It really does help me. It really does help this channel grow and my audience grow. So go ahead and hit that red subscribe button. And now, here is the video that you came here for. So Sunday night, just living my best life, doing what AT does, watching the NFL. I was actually watching college football because we had Cal UCLA, which I'll talk about later in the show. Do the podcast. Everything goes great. It's an amazing episode, as I said. And then, right as I finish recording, Will Muschamp is fired at the University of South Carolina. I think in some regards, it's not shocking at all. And in some regards, it's very, very, very shocking after South Carolina lost on Saturday night at Ole Miss. Lane Kiffin, if you saw it, he threw his clipboard up in the air because he was throwing 70, 80, 90-yard touchdown bombs. His quarterback was anyway. And Lane Kiffin was having the time of his life out there. But I think it showed how far this South Carolina program had fallen, where a first-year head coach at a non-traditional power comes in, whips Will Muschamp's butt. And I think that was the final nail, and I don't think it was ironic that this was the game where it happened, right? It's one thing if you lose to Bama and get smoked. It's one thing if you even lose to Georgia or Florida or whomever. But to lose to a non-traditional power, first-year head coach who's just throwing the ball all over the field and at the very least putting on a fun, exciting product, I think that really opened up the eyes to South Carolina's administrators and their fans, but he was fired. Now, in terms of the why it is surprising, let's start there. I think the reason it's surprising is because of the reason that I talked about on last Tuesday's episode. If you remember last Tuesday, I talked about Hugh Freeze and kind of the idea that he may potentially be a college football coaching candidate, and we'll get to Hugh Freeze in a minute. But when I talked about Hugh Freeze, I talked about the reality that in this era, in this moment in time in the pandemic, it's going to be really hard to fire people in college athletics, right? This isn't the professional ranks. These aren't privately owned teams. These are colleges and universities. They're places where athletic departments, I should say, are cutting jobs left and right. I saw where South Carolina's own AD said that he believed that the school could lose upwards of $60 million, 60, about 58 and change if you want to be exact, because of the fact that they were not able to sell season tickets. They were not able to sell mostly tickets at all for this season. And because of it, when you lose $60 million in revenue that you were anticipating having, you're going to have to make cutbacks. You're going to have to lay people off. And so because of it, there's kind of this notion in college athletics that there were going to be no major firings this year. Maybe we'd see a situation like Jim Harbaugh. He leaves Michigan, goes to the NFL. They don't owe him any money. But the idea of paying a head coach millions of dollars to not coach your college football program was just something that I don't think a lot of people thought would happen this year. And South Carolina was certainly one of those instances because South Carolina reportedly owes Will Muschamp around $13 million when they fired him on Sunday afternoon. And it really was one of those things where because that number is so big, because the economy is so crazy, because frankly boosters don't have the money that they once did because of this pandemic, there were a lot of people that really thought it wasn't going to happen. That is why it's surprising. Here is why it's not surprising, though. Have you seen Will Muschamp? He stinks. He's terrible. He's awful. And it really comes back down to what I said a minute ago. First of all, there's just the straight wins and losses, right? That does matter. I don't think you can argue that even though South Carolina is not a historically great program, the bottom line is that he was in year 5 now, so it's not as though that he can argue, I need more time, I need to bring in my guys, I need to do this, I need to do that. Well, guess what? He basically flipped over his entire coaching staff last offseason. It's year 5. He's got all his recruits in. You're basically out of excuses, and here we are. He was 2-5 this season. The only wins were against Vanderbilt early in the season and Auburn in a game that South Carolina easily could have lost. And like I said, when you go 28-30 overall, and that includes non-conference games, 17-22 in the SEC, it makes it hard for your school to justify keeping you in year 5. I would go again back to what I said at the beginning as well. I don't think that the timing of this is ironic or accidental with the fact that he was fired not only after a 3-game losing streak, but in the manner in which South Carolina lost the last 3 games, right? Keep in mind, 3 weeks ago, they play LSU. And I understand, by the way, I believe this was a game that wasn't on the schedule that got added. It might not have been. They might have supposed to have been playing LSU. But the reason I bring it up is because they go to LSU. LSU is playing their backup quarterback. Never forget their backup quarterback, not the starter. Again, I'm going to pull the Allen Iverson. I did it last week. I'll do it again. Not the starter, the backup. LSU puts up 52 points, beats them 52-24. You then the following week play Texas A&M. Texas A&M boat races you 48-3, and then as I said, you lose on Saturday night to Ole Miss at Ole Miss, where Lane Kiffin puts up almost 60 points on you. And so I think South Carolina started looking around and saying, "Now wait a second. It's one thing if you're in your first year. It's one thing if you're in your second year. It's one thing even if you're in your third year. But when you're in year 5, and Jimbo Fisher has his program in a completely different stratosphere than you do in year 3, that's not a good look. But, whatever. Texas A&M, historically a little bit more successful in South Carolina. You can kind of say he inherited a better situation. He inherited an experienced quarterback with Kellen Mond. But I think when you follow that up, first of all, you lose to the backup quarterback against LSU. LSU has lost every game they've played since, which I believe they've gone 0-2 since then. You lose to Texas A&M in their coach's 3rd year, but then you go to Ole Miss. First-year head coach, non-traditional power, struggling, not playing great at various points, although they beat Vandy going into the bye week, and you get boat raced. You got Lane Kiffin throwing his play sheet up in the air because he is out scheming the crap out of you. I think that was just a cold glass of water in the face of South Carolina fans of like, it's one thing if we're not competing with Georgia and Florida. It's another thing if Ole Miss is doing whatever they want. And so because of it, I think we have a scenario where South Carolina just realized how far they're falling behind, but more than how far they're falling behind, how uninteresting they are, right? And this is something I talk about all the time, but college football is one of those sports where historically there's haves and have-nots, right? And it's one thing if you stink. It's another thing if you stink and you're boring, right? Lane Kiffin, maybe he'll go 3-7, 4-8, 4-6 this year, whatever. But he's putting up points. He's having fun. He's throwing his play sheet. He's doing well. You look at Purdue with Jeff Brom. He hasn't been great, but they're scoring points. It's fun. It's entertaining. It's Purdue. You understand that you're not Ohio State or Michigan or Nebraska or whatever, but if you can put up points, be entertaining, pull off an upset here and there, everybody kind of gets like, this is the ceiling of what we can do. And so with South Carolina, not only are you bad, you're uninteresting, and you don't have a coach that's very likable. And I know the whole deal of, he's a nice guy behind the scenes. Well, if you stink and you're not entertaining, it doesn't matter how nice you are behind the scenes. It matters what happens on the field. And so because of it, I think I would say a couple things. First of all, with Will Muschamp, it's kind of incredible. I'm actually kind of genuinely curious to see what the next chapter of his career is, because it's crazy. I've been doing this so long that this has come full circle, which is when I first started writing about college football in any form or fashion. Will Muschamp was like the hot coaching candidate. He was the defensive coordinator at Texas. Everybody wanted him. He waited. He took his time. He ends up at Florida, and it just doesn't work. I will say I think that the circumstances that led him to South Carolina were not ideal for him or the school. If you remember, South Carolina, I believe, and I talked to Seth Emerson about this on the podcast a few weeks ago, South Carolina was in position to hire Kirby Smart. They thought they were getting Kirby Smart. Then Georgia fires Mark Richt out of nowhere, and all of a sudden you're looking around saying like, oh my goodness, the guy that we wanted, and we have nowhere to go, nothing to do. It felt like they froze. It felt like they panicked, and it felt like they forced themselves into Will Muschamp, who, as we all know, I'm not breaking any news here, wasn't very good at Florida either. And for people who don't remember that situation, he took over for Urban Meyer, so took over a program that was in turmoil. There were problems internally. Players were getting away with stuff. But you couldn't argue that the team wasn't successful and that he didn't have a good infrastructure to win games. But I bring all this up just to very simply say that, he didn't work at Florida, and I feel like South Carolina kind of froze when they thought they were going to get Kirby Smart. And then on the opposite side, I think Will Muschamp, I know it's an SEC job. I know you're going to get paid $25 million, and you'll probably never have to work again if you don't want to. But he had only done 1 year following Florida, and it felt like it was maybe the right opportunity for him to sit out, to relax, to take to work as a defensive coordinator. If memory serves me correct, he was only at Auburn as their defensive coordinator for 1 season, and I believe Gus Malzahn was kind of mad. He paid him a lot of money to come to South Carolina to be the coordinator, and you wonder if Will Muschamp maybe should have been a little bit taken more time, right? Like I remember even talking about it when that hiring happened. And I didn't have any platform like this on a podcast or anything, but I remember it being like it just felt rushed, right? It felt rushed from South Carolina's perspective. It felt rushed from Will Muschamp's perspective. And I will say, I'm curious to see what the next chapter is because I still think he can be a successful defensive coordinator, but he's just not head coaching material. And that's the deal, right? Sometimes in life, you're really good as a number 2, you're really good as an assistant, but he wasn't good as a head coach. So now I think the question becomes what's next for South Carolina? And that's where, to me, it gets really interesting, right? Because I think you can look at this from a number of different perspectives. First of all, I have a buddy named Mark Ryan, who's a radio host down in South Carolina. He wants Brent Venables, who is the Clemson defensive coordinator, as South Carolina's next head coach. And I'll just be honest, I don't see it. Don't know if you've watched Clemson lately, but Brent Venables is a lunatic, defensive-minded, defense-first guy that's kind of crazy. And I don't know if he's a yeller and a screamer like Will Muschamp, but he's definitely emotional. And the one thing I can tell you about college athletics is that when you fire somebody because they don't work, I can just tell you that in general, and I know this from talking to coaches and ADs in football and basketball, is they oftentimes pursue somebody who's the opposite of the guy that they just fired. Whether it's the best candidate or not, that is often how it ends up happening. You fire an old guy, he's a little old, he's kind of behind the times. You hire the young, brash, ambitious guy. You fire the young, brash, ambitious guy, you go get the old guy. He's been around the block. Things are a little bit slower. You have a player's coach, he's a little more lax. You fire him, you bring in the strict disciplinarian and vice versa. That's just how it works. Maybe I'm crazy. I don't think Brent Venables, to me, is the first name that comes to mind. Now, I will say, first name that does come to mind is the guy that I talked about a few episodes ago, which was, of course, it was Hugh Freeze. And so there's a couple variables with Hugh Freeze here, right? First of all, I think on the negative side, one, he just signed an extension with Liberty. I'm not sold that I don't know if he'll be able to get out of that in 1 season. I don't know if he is in a rush to get back to the SEC. He's got a good deal at Liberty. My understanding is he's one of the highest paid non-Power 5 coaches in college football. And so maybe he sits around, maybe he waits for a better opportunity, or at the very least stays at Liberty a little bit longer. I don't think money is as much of an issue for him. Money's an issue for everybody, but he's made a lot of money. I don't think he's rushing to get back if it's not the right situation. I'll give you an example on this. Steve Sarkisian, the Alabama offensive coordinator, former USC head coach. Steve Sarkisian was offered the Colorado job last year, and he could have taken it, but he said, it doesn't feel right, timing's not right, let me take my time, let me find a better job. Maybe South Carolina is the job, ironically enough, but I think you get to a certain point in your career where sometimes you're not always rushing to the next spot. So with Hugh Freeze, I think there's that variable. He just signed an extension. There is the fact that the SEC, I don't know how to put this delicately, but they really frown upon bringing in guys with previous NCAA rules violations. And while nothing was directly attributed to Hugh Freeze from his time at Ole Miss, as you remember, they had major recruiting and rules violations. The Laramie Tunsil gas mask bong. There was texts of somebody paying Laramie Tunsil's bills. Greg Sankey has made it a point, I don't want these guys coming back into the conference. I think at one point Nick Saban tried to hire Hugh Freeze as either an offensive coordinator or an offensive coach, and the conference kind of balked, right? The conference kind of balked when Lane Kiffin was brought back as an offensive coordinator for Alabama. And I do think there would be some hesitation from the SEC office, although I don't know that they would stand in the way from taking Will Muschamp or taking Hugh Freeze if they believe that he is the best candidate. Those are the negatives of Hugh Freeze. Of course, the positive is the most obvious. The guy wins everywhere. He is a rock star. As I said on the show last week, I believe he's one of the 7 or 8 best coaches in college football. You don't go to Liberty and go 7-0, beat Virginia Tech, beat Syracuse in your second season transitioning from FCS football. Keep in mind, he doesn't even have a full roster of guys recruited to play FBS football, and he's 7-0 going for 8-0 this weekend against North Carolina State. So that's like why you hire Hugh Freeze, because he's awesome and he's really good. I do think there will be some hurdles, and one of the hurdles will be just frankly, does he want the job? In that same vein, I think the guy that makes the most sense to me, the name that I've been hearing, is a guy named Billy Napier, who is the head coach at Louisiana. I will not bore you to tears with his resume, but Louisiana, of course, was the team, if you remember, week 1 of this season. They upset Iowa State at Iowa State. They went 11-3 last year. He's a young guy. He's an offensive first guy. They had one of the top 10 offenses in college football last season. And as I just said a minute ago, they're 7-0 this year, 7-1 this year, Their only loss was to Coastal Carolina, who's a really good team, and they are ranked in the top 25 as I speak here, with Louisiana coming back into the top 25 this week. Some people are pushing for the Coastal Carolina coach. There's other guys in the mix, but to me, listen, I'm not gonna lie. I told you on last Tuesday's show, if I could go get Hugh Freeze, I'd go get Hugh Freeze because I think he gives them the best chance to win, but I do think the Billy Napier guy would be probably a more logical fit. We will see if he's interested. He's another one like Steve Sarkisian that turned down some opportunities last year. We will see if he has interest. But that is the deal with South Carolina. That is who I believe that they should go after, and all I'll say is it's going to be fascinating to see what happens. I think it goes without saying that South Carolina fired Will Muschamp when they could to go out and get the best candidate that they possibly could and do it before any other job opens up, right? Like at some point, Michigan, which we're going to talk about, Michigan's going to open up. Now, Jim Harbaugh is going to go to the NFL. The school might not owe him any money, but Michigan's going to, there's no way Michigan keeps going the way that they're going right now. USC may open up at some point. Obviously, if USC opens up, that means some other good job is going to open up because you're going to have to replace Clay Helton. So does that mean that maybe potentially you're talking about a scenario where James Franklin goes to USC, Penn State then, of course, has an opening. So the point being, South Carolina did this at this time to get ahead of schedule, to get the best candidate possible, and it'll be interesting to see what they did. But listen, I understand it's a pandemic. I understand money is tight, but they had to do what they thought was best for their athletic department, and they did what they did. I get it, and I hope they're more interesting. I hope they go get somebody interesting because the SEC is full of interesting coaches, whether it is Lane Kiffin, Nick Saban, Ed Orgeron, Mike Leach, Dan Mullen, Jimbo Fisher, and now we'll see what South Carolina